The man materializing from the swirling dust of the plains is more spirit than flesh. He stumbles up the long path to her porch, a wraith clinging to the last threads of life, his face a mask of dried blood and exhaustion. Alara watches him from the window of the sprawling ranch house, a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She is alone here, has been for 2 years since Caleb died, and solitude has honed her senses to a razor's edge. This man is not a threat in the usual sense. He is a different kind of danger, the kind that brings trouble trailing behind it like a pack of wolves. He collapses against the porch steps, his breathing a ragged, painful sound that cuts through the moan of the wind. He is Apache, she can see that now. His long black hair is matted with dirt, his buckskin's torn, and a dark, ugly stain is spreading across his thigh. When he looks up, his eyes, black as obsidian, find hers through the glass. They hold no plea for mercy, only a raw, desperate challenge. He has come here to die or to live, and the choice, he knows, is hers. Alara unlatches the door, the rifle held steady. He pushes himself up onto one elbow, the effort costing him dearly. His voice is a dry rasp, barely a whisper, but the words are clear, shocking, and stripped of all pride. "Let me remain," he implores, his gaze unwavering. "I'll bed you." Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. The words hang in the air between them, stark and profane. He is offering the last thing he has, the base currency of his body for the simple mercy of sanctuary. A tremor of something, disgust, pity, a strange and unwelcome flicker of understanding, ran through her. This was the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose, not even his honor. And with 3 words, her quiet, lonely world was about to be irrevocably broken open. The silence that followed his proposal was deeper than the vast, empty plains surrounding her ranch. Alara's knuckles were white where she gripped the stock of the Winchester. The wind whipped a strand of her auburn hair across her face, and she didn't bother to brush it away. Her mind, usually so clear and decisive, was a maelstrom. She had faced down rustlers, blizzards, and the predatory condolences of her neighbors after Caleb's passing. She ran this 1,000-acre ranch with an iron will because she had to, but no one had ever looked at her with such raw, transactional need. She lowered the rifle, just an inch. It was less a sign of trust and more a concession to the absurdity of the situation. The man was half dead. He couldn't harm her if he tried. His offer wasn't a threat, it was a surrender. "The barn," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, tight and strained. "There's a clean stall in the back. Water in the trough." Relief, so profound it was almost a collapse, washed over his features. He tried to nod, a jerky movement of his head. He didn't question her rejection of his terms. He simply accepted the reprieve she'd granted. Watching him try to crawl towards the barn was a pathetic sight. He moved a few feet, his wounded leg dragging uselessly, before his strength gave out entirely. He lay panting in the dust, his face turned away from her, a posture of complete defeat. A sigh escaped Alara's lips, laced with frustration at herself, at him, at the unforgiving land that bred such desperate moments. She had her rules for survival, and bringing a wounded Apache into her world violated every single one of them. He was a complication she couldn't afford, a beacon for the very trouble she worked so hard to avoid. The folks in Cedar Flats already thought her peculiar, a wealthy widow clinging to a man's work. Harboring a native would be seen as an unforgivable transgression. They would call it madness, or worse. Yet, she couldn't leave him there to die in her yard. Whatever Caleb had been, he had not been a cruel man. Some small part of his decency, or her memory of it, still lived within her. She propped the Winchester against the doorframe and walked out onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning under her boots. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. "Can you stand?" she asked, her tone clipped and impersonal. He didn't answer, only shook his head. Alara went back inside, returning with a flask of whiskey and a roll of clean linen she'd been meaning to mend. She knelt beside him, the dust of her own land puffing up around her skirts. The smell of sweat, blood, and earth rose from him. She uncorked the flask and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, the liquor spilling down his chin. When he was done, he coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his entire frame. "I am Alara," she said, not knowing why she offered her name. "Alara Croft," she corrected herself immediately, a bitter taste in her mouth. "Alara Hayes. Croft was my neighbor." He looked at her then, his focus sharpened by the whiskey. "Cale," he rasped. "Just the one name." It was enough. She tore a strip from the linen and began to clean the gash on his thigh. It was a bullet wound, old enough to be badly infected but not so old as to be gangrenous. He hissed as she worked, his body rigid with pain, but he made no other sound. His stoicism was a thing of stone and iron. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the wound. His back arched, and a strangled cry was torn from his throat, but he clamped his jaw shut before it could fully escape. When she was finished, she bandaged it tightly. "The barn," she repeated, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll help you." Leaning on her, Cale was a dead weight of fevered muscle and bone. The short walk to the barn felt like a mile. She settled him into a stall filled with fresh, sweet-smelling hay, a world away from the dusty yard. She brought him a bucket of water and a plate with a piece of bread and salted pork. He ate like a starving animal, his eyes never leaving her, as if he expected her to snatch the food away at any moment. That night, Alara sat in Caleb's oversized armchair by the cold hearth, the rifle across her lap. She didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind, was the sound of discovery. She imagined the sheriff, Josiah Miller, riding up with a posse. She imagined the scornful gaze of Silas Croft, the neighboring rancher who had been circling her property like a vulture since Caleb's funeral, his proposals of marriage thinly veiled attempts to merge their lands. Harboring Cale was a risk that could cost her everything. And for what? For a man who had offered to trade his body for shelter. The memory of his words made a strange heat rise in her cheeks. It was shameful, deplorable, and yet there was a brutal honesty to it she couldn't entirely condemn. In this world, you traded what you had. He had nothing but the flesh on his bones. She had a barn, food, and medicine. The transaction had been made, just not on his proposed terms. The next morning, she found him awake, his fever slightly down. He had drunk most of the water and had tried to tidy the stall, a small, absurd gesture of order in the chaos of his situation. He watched her approach with the same cautious intensity as a cornered coyote. She carried a bowl of hot broth and another flask, this one filled with a bitter herbal remedy her mother had taught her to brew for fevers. "Drink this," she ordered, setting it down just outside the stall. He obeyed without question. For 3 days, this was their routine. She would bring him food, water, and medicine. She would change his dressing. They rarely spoke. The barn became a silent space of healing, a world separate from the main house. She found herself watching him when he didn't know it. She saw the way his hands, though weakened, were deft and sure as he rebraided a frayed piece of rope he'd found. She saw the proud set of his jaw, even in sleep. He was not just a desperate man. He was a man who had been stripped of everything but his core. On the 4th day, she arrived to find him on his feet, leaning heavily against the stall door. He had used a strip of leather to bind his wounded thigh for support. "I can work," he said. His voice was stronger now, a low baritone that resonated in the quiet barn. "You can barely stand. The pump by the well. The handle is loose. It wastes water," he stated, not as a request, but as an observation. "I can fix it." Alara was taken aback. She knew the pump was loose. It had been for a month. She just hadn't had the time or the right tool to fix it properly. "How would you know how to fix a pump?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that changed his entire face. "My people learn to fix what is broken, or we do without." She hesitated, then nodded. "The tools are in the shed. Don't overdo it." She watched from the kitchen window as he limped to the well. He moved with a painful, deliberate grace. He worked for hours, his movements economical and precise. He didn't just tighten the handle. He disassembled part of the mechanism, reshaping a worn metal pin with a hammer and a piece of scrap iron until it fit perfectly. By midday, the pump worked smoother and quieter than it had in years. When he was done, he sat in the shade of the barn, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Alara brought him a cup of cool water. He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a brief second. A jolt, small but sharp, passed between them. It was the first time they had touched without the clinical necessity of tending his wound. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than desperation or pain in them. It was a flicker of gratitude, and beneath that, a quiet, profound dignity. That small repair shifted something between them. He was no longer just a patient or a charity case. He had contributed. He had given something back. The unspoken debt was beginning to be repaid, not with the currency he had first offered, but with something far more valuable, his skill, his effort. Over the next few weeks, a new rhythm established itself. Cale moved from the stall to a small and used tack room in the barn, giving him a modicum of privacy. He was a silent, tireless worker. He mended fences that had been down since spring, his stitches of wire as neat as any she'd ever seen. He reinforced a loose beam in the stable roof, moving with an uncanny sense of balance and strength that belied his recent injury. He had a way with the horses, a low murmur, and a steady hand that calmed even her most skittish mare. Alara found herself leaving larger portions of food for him, a better cut of meat, an extra biscuit. She left a bar of soap and a clean set of Caleb's old work clothes by the barn door one evening. The next morning, she saw the clothes hanging to dry, washed clean, and Cale's own tattered buckskins were gone. When she saw him later, his hair washed and tied back with a leather thong, the familiar shape of her late husband's shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, a strange pang went through her heart. It was a confusing mix of grief, guilt, and something new she refused to name. Their conversations remained sparse, functional. The fence at the north pasture needs wire. The mare threw a shoe, more rain coming. Yet, in the spaces between the words, a language was forming. It was in the way he'd leave a pile of perfectly chopped kindling by her back door before she woke, or the way she'd leave a steaming cup of coffee for him on the porch rail as the sun rose. It was a partnership built in silence, on a foundation of mutual respect for hard work. She learned about him in fragments, not from what he said, but from what he did. He was a man who understood the land, the flow of water, the language of animals. He could read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks. He was a survivor, but more than that, he was a man of immense competence. The ranch, which had felt so overwhelming since Caleb's death, began to feel manageable again. The crushing weight of her solitude lessened, replaced by the quiet, steady presence of the man in her barn. One evening, Silas Croft rode over, unannounced as always. He was a big man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted and surveyed her property with a proprietary air that always set Alara's teeth on edge. "Evenin', Alara," he boomed, his voice overly friendly. "Just checkin' on my favorite neighbor. Seein' if you need a strong hand with anything." "I'm managing just fine, Silas," she said, her tone cool. She stood on the porch, creating a physical barrier between them. His gaze swept over the neatly mended fence line, the solid-looking stable roof, the smoothly operating well pump. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "Managin' more than fine, it looks like. You've been busy. Hard for a woman alone to keep up with all this. I'm more capable than you give me credit for." Suddenly, his eyes narrowed. He was looking past her, towards the barn. Cale, unaware of their visitor, was leading the horses in from the pasture. He moved with his characteristic quiet grace, his limp now barely noticeable. Silas's jaw tightened. Well, he said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Looks like you found yourself some help after all. Didn't know you were in the market for a hired hand. Especially not that kind." The slur hung in the air, thick and ugly. Alara's back went rigid. "My ranch hands are my business, Silas." Cale had seen them now. He stopped, his posture becoming instantly wary. He stood by the corral, a silent, watchful statue, making no move to approach or retreat. Silas chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "That ain't no ranch hand, Alara, and you know it. That's a stray. A dangerous one. People in town have been talking. Rumors about a renegade Apache seen up in these hills. One that got away from the soldiers down south. There's a bounty on his head." Alara's blood ran cold. A bounty. That explained the bullet wound, the desperation. He wasn't just a wanderer. He was a hunted man. You're listening to gossip, Silas, she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel into her voice. Am I? He took a step closer to the porch, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A lone woman like you. It ain't safe. You need a husband. You need protection. You send that savage on his way, and you and I can talk about a proper arrangement. An arrangement that will keep you safe and secure. His proposal, so different from Cale's, was 1,000 times more repulsive. Cale had offered his body in desperation. Silas was offering his protection in exchange for her land, her independence, her very self. I don't need your protection, Silas, she said, her voice like ice. And I don't take kindly to you telling me who I can and cannot have on my property. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to do. She turned her back on him and walked into the house, shutting the door firmly behind her. She leaned against it, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the window, she saw Silas stare at the house for a long moment, his face a mask of fury and resentment. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, but Alara knew this was far from over. He had seen Cale. He had a name for his suspicions now. He would not let it go. That night, a brutal thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that shook the very foundations of the house. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked like the sky was splitting apart. Alara paced the kitchen, unable to settle. She thought of Cale in the tack room, a space that was dry but not much more. The wind howled, and she imagined it tearing at the barn. On impulse, she lit a lantern, pulled on a heavy oilskin coat, and battled her way through the storm to the barn. The wind nearly ripped the door from her hands. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and rain. She found Cale sitting on his cot, sharpening a knife by the light of a single candle. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. The roof might not hold, she said, shouting to be heard over the roar of the storm. He simply nodded, his eyes on her face. Come up to the house, she said, just until it passes. He hesitated. The house was her space. Their unspoken agreement had always kept them separate, maintaining a careful distance. To cross that threshold was to change the nature of their arrangement entirely. It's just a storm, she said, a little too sharply. Don't be a fool. He stood, his movements fluid in the flickering light. He followed her back to the house, the two of them hunched against the gale. Inside, the warmth and quiet were a shock after the chaos outside. She took his wet coat and hung it by the hearth. He stood awkwardly in the center of her kitchen, looking out of place, and yet, somehow, not. He was bigger than she remembered, his presence filling the room. The house, which had felt so empty for 2 years, now felt occupied. It was a disconcerting feeling. I'll make some coffee, she said, needing something to do with her hands. They sat at the kitchen table, the storm raging outside, the coffee mugs warming their palms. The silence in the house was different from the silence of the barn. It was more intimate, more charged. The memory of his first words to her, I'll bed you, surfaced in her mind, unbidden. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The man who sat before her now was not the same desperate creature who had collapsed on her porch. Silas Croft was here, she said, breaking the silence. He saw you. Cale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He said, there's a bounty. She watched his face for a reaction. He looked down at his hands, at the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. They killed my wife, he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. My son. They were hunting us for sport, calling it justice. I was the only one who escaped. The simple, brutal words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The depth of his loss, the horror of what he had endured, was suddenly real to her. He was not a criminal. He was a man who had lost everything, a man running for his life. Her protection of him, which had started as a moment of conflicted pity, now felt like a moral imperative. He won't stop, Cale continued, his eyes meeting hers. Men like Croft, they use the law as a weapon. He wants your land. He will use me to get to it. You should have turned me away. And let you die in my yard, she retorted. What kind of person would that make me? A safe one, he answered simply. The storm raged on, but the turmoil inside Alara was greater. She looked at Cale, at the quiet strength in his face, the profound sorrow in his eyes. She thought of the lonely years stretching behind her and the emptier ones stretching ahead. She thought of Silas Croft and his greedy, suffocating protection she had been surviving, just like Kale. She had been holding her ground, defending her small patch of the world from those who would take it. In that moment, she realized they were not so different. Both of them were fighting to hold on to what was theirs, to live with a measure of dignity in a world that sought to strip it from them. "He will come back," she said, her voice steady. "With the sheriff. I know. We need to be ready." A new understanding passed between them, forged in the heart of the storm. They were no longer a rancher and her hired hand. They were allies. The unspoken contract between them had been rewritten. It was no longer about a debt of labor for a debt of life. It was about standing together against a common threat. The storm eventually passed, leaving the air washed clean and a profound stillness in its wake. But the peace was fragile. They both knew it was just the calm before the next, more dangerous storm arrived. A week later, they came. Alara saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before she could make out the riders. There were 3 of them. Silas Croft, looking smug and triumphant. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary resignation, and a deputy she didn't recognize. Kale was in the corral, working with the mare. He saw them too. He straightened up, his body going taut, but he did not run. He simply stood his ground, waiting. Alara wiped her hands on her apron and walked out onto the porch, positioning herself at the top of the steps. She did not bring the rifle. This was not a fight to be won with bullets, but with will. The 3 men rode into her yard and dismounted. Silas couldn't contain his smirk. "Morning, Alara," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Sorry to bother you, but we've had a report. A serious one." "A report from him?" Alara asked, nodding her head towards Silas. "Now, Alara," Silas began, puffing out his chest. "I'm just a concerned citizen. It's my duty to report a known fugitive, a dangerous murderer hiding out in our midst. The only danger I've seen lately, Silas, is you sniffing around my property line," she shot back. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the fact is, we have a warrant for an Apache male, goes by Kale. Matches the description of the man standing right over there. Accused of killing 2 soldiers down in the territory." "Accused," Alara repeated, her voice sharp. "That's a long way from guilty, Sheriff. Be that as it may, the law requires me to take him in." Kale had begun to walk slowly from the corral towards the house. He moved without fear, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, ignoring Silas completely. He came to stand at the bottom of the steps, a few feet to Alara's side. He was placing himself between her and them, a silent protector. "He's not going with you," Alara said. Her voice was calm, but it held a core of unshakable steel. The sheriff sighed. "Alara, don't make this difficult. I have respect for you, and for what your husband built here. But the law is the law. I can't let you harbor a wanted man." "He is not a wanted man," Alara stated, her voice ringing with an authority that made all 3 men pause. "He is my husband." The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. Even the buzzing of the flies seemed to cease. Silas Croft's jaw dropped, his face turning a shade of purple. The deputy shuffled his feet, looking anywhere but at Alara. Sheriff Miller simply stared, his weary eyes wide with disbelief. "You're... what?" the sheriff finally managed to stammer. "My husband," Alara repeated, her gaze unwavering. She took a half step to the side and laid her hand on Kale's arm. She felt the solid muscle tense beneath her touch, but he did not flinch. "We were married by a traveling preacher 2 weeks ago. He is Kale Hayes now. As my husband, he resides here, on my property, under my protection, and under the protection of the law." It was a lie, a glorious, breathtaking lie. But as she said the words, they felt truer than anything she had said in years. She was claiming him, not as a laborer, not as a fugitive, but as her own. Silas found his voice, sputtering with rage. "You're lying. There's no preacher, no record. She's lying to protect him, Sheriff." "Do you have proof of that, Silas?" Alara asked coolly. "Or is this just another one of your attempts to harass me off my land? A federal marshal might be very interested to hear about your campaign of intimidation against a widow." She had played her trump card. Her wealth, her status as Caleb Hayes' widow, gave her a standing in the community that Silas, for all his bluster, could not easily overcome. She was accusing him of a crime in front of the law, turning his own tactic back on him. Sheriff Miller looked from Alara's resolute face to Silas's sputtering rage, then to Cale, who stood silent and dignified beside the woman who had just claimed him. Cale's expression was one of profound, stunned gratitude. The sheriff was a man of the law, but he was also a man who understood the nuances of the frontier. He could see greed and malice in Silas Croft's eyes, and he could see something else entirely in the way Alara and Cale stood together. It looked, against all odds, like the truth. A man's home is his castle, Silas, the sheriff said slowly, his decision made. And a husband has a right to be in his wife's home. Unless you have a witness to dispute Mrs. Hayes's claim, my business here is concluded. But the warrant, Silas yelled. The warrant is for an Apache named Cale. This man, the sheriff said, gesturing with his thumb, is Cale Hayes, a citizen by marriage, according to his wife. It's a different matter now. A legal matter. You want to pursue it, you'll need a lawyer and a judge, not a posse. He turned to Alara, tipping his hat once more. Ma'am. Mr. Hayes, he acknowledged Cale with a nod, then mounted his horse. The deputy, looking relieved, followed suit. Silas Croft stood alone in the yard, his face a thunderous mask of defeat and hatred. He stared at Alara, his eyes promising retribution. But for now, he was powerless. He had been outmaneuvered. With a final curse, he swung himself onto his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. The yard fell silent again. The threat had passed. Alara's hand was still on Cale's arm. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. She slowly let her hand drop, the energy of the confrontation draining away, leaving her trembling slightly. Cale turned to face her. His dark eyes searched her face, filled with a depth of emotion that left her breathless. He had been a hunted animal, and with a few bold words, she had given him a name, a home, a shield. She had bound him to her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the edge of her sleeve between his thumb and forefinger. The gesture was tentative, reverent. You did not have to do that, he said, his voice quiet. Yes, she answered, her own voice barely a whisper. I did. He looked around at the ranch, at the house, at the vast expanse of land that was now, by her declaration, his sanctuary, his home. A life had been offered, a new one, born not of a desperate, shameful plea, but of courage and defiance. He looked back at her, and the ghost of a smile she had seen once before returned, this time not fleeting, but full of a light that seemed to warm her to her very soul. He said nothing more, but his eyes conveyed everything. The transaction he had proposed on her doorstep all those weeks ago had finally been completed. He had offered his body for a place to remain. Instead, she had given him her name, and in doing so, had found a reason to remain herself. Standing there on the porch, with the dust of their vanquished enemy settling around them, Alara knew she was no longer a widow managing a ranch. She was a woman standing beside her husband, ready to face whatever came next, together. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the powerful, unspoken promise of a new beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.